So in this next section, I'm going to talk about another type of lab you could do on our rack rentals, which I call a FreeFlow Experimentation lab. Now this lab assumes you've already done the initial build or the build it lab, and that initial build or build it lab is done. You saved your configurations, and now you're coming back like an hour later or a day later. You're loading those saved configurations of that build it lab, and now we're going to move on from there. Remember, all of this is with the goal or the objective of memorizing commands, becoming familiar with the output of those commands, becoming familiar with what command is pertinent or applicable in any given situation. So FreeFlow Experiment Lab. This, I would reserve no more than 30 or 60 minutes to do this. And the idea behind a FreeFlow Experimentation Lab is that you're going to be intentionally breaking things, right, to see what happens. For example, you've just studied OSPF, and you've learned that, okay, well, if two OSPF routers are doing authentication, they need to have the same kind of authentication. Well, what happens if they don't have the same kind? What if one router is doing plain text and the other is doing MD5 authentication? So I would write out my objectives in advance, once again, if you can, right? So in advance, say, okay, this is one thing I'm thinking of breaking authentication, and then maybe a sub-bullet, different authentication types, maybe a sub-bullet beneath that. Incorrect mismatched passwords, maybe a sub-bullet beneath that. One router is doing authentication, one router is not doing authentication at all. So I'm making in my objectives a list of things that I want to test, I want to experiment on. So these are things like things that you want to break, see what happens when it breaks. These are, maybe you have in your mind, well, I want to actually, so one of my objectives might be, I actually want to find a debug that will show me what's actually happening when two routers become OSPF neighbors, when they form an OSPF adjacency. I actually want to see that in a debug, and I want to get familiar with the output of that debug and what the relevant fields are. Also, maybe I want to practice a bunch of show commands. As I was going through the configuration guides, it gave me, a show IP OSPF neighbor, show IP OSPF database, and a bunch of other show stuff. I want to practice with those show commands, and I want to look at the output and maybe make sure I understand everything that's going to be in the output. Now, why do I say only 30 to 60 minutes here? A FreeFlow Experimentation Lab is going to naturally lead you to have a bunch of questions. You're going to wonder, what does that portion of the output mean? Or, here's a debug command, what would happen if I turn it on? Or, how come nothing's happening when I turn it on? Or, how come this show command isn't showing me any output? Or, what does this acronym mean above this column? You're going to have a whole bunch of questions in your head that are going to come up as you do this lab, which is going to lead you to Google or whatever resource you use. Well, you don't want to be Googling for things and looking stuff up while your tokens are being used and time is counting down. There's no sense in setting a 2-hour time window of a lab if during an hour of that, you're going to be doing research and looking stuff up. You're wasting your time. So the idea here is to write down in advance what your objectives are, what you want to break, what you want to play around with. This is a time to play around and experiment. All right, you've already built something, something's already working, you've already proven to yourself you can get something to work. Now we're going to take it to the next level. I want to see what it looks like when it breaks. I want to see what it looks like when I intentionally do things wrong. I want to use show and debug commands, become familiar with the output, and become familiar with, if this is what I want, if I'm looking for this information, which show command, which debug command will give me the best output for what I want. This is your time to answer those questions. And so a short window of time is best for you to do this type of a lab. So in this type of lab, you're going to be very liberally using the command line help of iOS. So during the initial build it lab, you didn't want to use that command line help if at all possible. You want to have your solutions and your configs in front of you so you could refer to that, refer to your configuration guides and your command references. Here now is your time to sit back and just play. Just play around, see what happens. So that concludes the FreeFlow Experimentation Lab. In the last section, the last video of the series, I'm going to talk about the third type of lab you could do for your CCNA all the way up to your CCIE practice time.